Good day and good vibe, and welcome to another episode of Chill Art. Chill Art is a public service program of the Leesburg Center for the Arts. The program's goal is to help people shift focus to the positive. Body-mind experts and guest contributors from across the globe volunteer to present their mindfulness modalities and give our viewers tools to better cope during challenging times. Then, after their presentations, we walk you through a short, no artistic ability required art project. Think of them as fun, creative, moving meditations that calm the soul and raise the spirit.
Well, hi guys. My name is Gary SLIGH. I have a small craft shop in downtown Leesburg, Florida. I have cross-stitch needlework, weaving, and I have about 30 different local artists who display their work here. By way of quick introduction, I started out my professional life as a United Methodist minister, was an at-home dad for our 3 kids for 7 years. Finished my PhD in literature, and we moved to Florida so I could work at Lake Sumter State College. Retired from there in 2016 and decided to do what I've loved my whole life, which is cross-stitch, needlework, handcrafts. And the reason I wanted to spend some time today is just talk about the conviction that I have that this handwork, this stitching, this weaving, these different prospects that we create with our hands is really a meditative process. I've done some specific study of meditation in various religious traditions. I visited India and talked to folks there about yoga and meditative breathing. Know a lot about contemplative prayer and some of those kind of things that people use as spiritual practices. I honestly believe that working with your hands and creating things has some of the same qualities and gives you some of the same kind of calming, meditative processes that those other things talk about. There is one book that I always want to mention when I'm talking about this. It's a beautiful book by Claire Hunter, who's a Scottish writer, called Threads of Life, A History of the World Through the Eye of a Needle. She highlights some specific ideas that you can certainly go into in more depth if you read her book or if you look at other research. She talks about the use of needlework and handwork in helping people get through trauma. After World War I, there's a real famous program that was developed in New Zealand where soldiers who had what we now call PTSD learned how to do embroidery and needlework in order to calm their nerves and give themselves a sense of purpose. Hunter herself has some wonderful stories of women and men in prisoner of war camps who found meaning and purpose and maybe even a voice in doing stitching and embroidery while they were in captivity. I personally have worked with folks lately who have experienced traumatic brain injury and who have used the process of weaving as a way to find, as a therapy, as a way to get back into some of the things that they used to enjoy before their injuries occurred. The other thing that I always like to stress when people come into the shop and they're looking for a way to use their talents and they're looking for some kind of handmade meditative process is that I really do believe there are different styles of stitching and handwork that represent different personalities. So that's kind of the way I want to approach this, is I want to talk about a couple of different ways that we in the stitching world do handwork, and maybe explain just briefly what that means in terms of how it fits with personalities. Because certainly, if you pick up a handwork project and it frustrates you and it makes you scream and cry, that's not a very good meditative process. And not every style of stitching and handwork works with everybody. So you do really want to find something that drives you and gives you passion. I spend 30, 40 hours a week doing counted cross stitch. I love the detail of it. I love the fact that I can start with a blank canvas, and when I am done, something has emerged from that blank canvas. And when I'm lost in counted cross stitch, I am in a different place. I really do find a great deal of comfort in that. I get up a little earlier every morning just so I can stitch a bit. One of my dear friends, Maria, who has now died, used to tell me that cross stitch centered her and helped her to find a real purpose in the space that she was in. So the first thing I want to talk about is counted cross stitch, which is my chief passion. Counted cross stitch is fairly easy from a technique standpoint. All you have to do is be able to count and make X's. But as I said, for me, the process of creating with counted cross stitch gives me the opportunity in a way that I really don't have in any other part of my life to feel specifically creative. I start with a blank piece of cloth, and from that I create something. I'm working on a cross stitch pattern right now, which is a Christmas stocking, and you can't see the detail here, but this has tiny little stitches that I'm counting and using, and if you can see the canvas, you can see that there's some little apples and some little oranges that have begun to emerge already from what I've been doing. Behind me is a framed piece that I did, and I'm going to turn around here awkwardly and try to get it into view. This is a counted cross stitch piece made from a photograph. That's 60,000 stitches. That took 18 months to do. It's not for the faint of heart. But what I love about this, again, is that it emerged from a blank piece of canvas, and also that it's very unique. This is done from a digital photograph. So nobody else really will ever have anything quite like that. That was a gift for my son when he graduated from the University of Virginia. So if you are a detail person, if you get lost in the details of projects, cross stitch can transport you. One of the favorite stories that a woman told me when she came into the shop a few months ago, an older woman said that when she sits down to cross stitch, she feels like that little girl who used to go out in the yard and play all by herself and get lost in another world. And I just love that image. And I identified with it immediately, because when I got lost in what I'm doing with my cross stitch, nothing else really matters. Now, cross stitch is very regimented, and you do have to count and follow directions. Let's say you're a little more innovative. You're not quite the type that wants to follow directions in the same way. Embroidery, which is just kind of a take on cross stitch, allows you to do daisies and loops and all sorts of things. There's a crazy quilt here in the shop, which is a wonderful example of just freehand embroidery. And again, you can't see much of the detail here, but crazy quilts lend themselves to this kind of style. A lot of time I have young folks who come in and they look at the patterns and the regimen of cross stitch, and you can kind of see their eyes roll back in their head. But then when they realize they can trace a daisy on the back of their blue jeans and stitch that daisy and make it whatever color they want, and they're not bounded by any of the structures of cross stitch, then I can kind of see them light up a little bit. So embroidery, which is really just another take on cross stitch, is a more freehand kind of way of handling it. Sometimes for me, and it's not that I always do cross stitch, sometimes for me I like a meditative process that's repetitive, that is mindless, that takes me away to another place, but does not require a lot of concentration. I always carry a project with me when I travel. And if I'm in the airport, you're likely to see me working on something. But that's not a 60,000 piece counted cross stitch project. That's going to be something small and probably fairly repetitive. Let me show you an example of something that I carried with me recently. This is a needlepoint canvas, and you can see that I've already stitched the chrysanthemum in the middle of that. But now what I've got to do is I've got to fill in all the background stitches with this burnished gold. And that's a perfect project for an airport. I do it on a diagonal, which is called a basket weave stitch, so that the fabric doesn't get all wonky when I'm done. But I can sit and do basket weave, and I don't have to count. I don't have to pay attention. The light doesn't have to be perfect, and I don't have to be in my favorite chair. So that's a nice little kind of an idea. And needlepoint is a wonderful legacy. Needlepoint is strong. It lasts hundreds of years. I just finished a project that was begun 75 years ago. And I finished it, and I'm firmly convinced it'll be around another 100 years. So when you're looking for legacy projects and also repetition, that's a good one. Another passion of mine is weaving. And we don't have room here in the scope of where I'm sitting right now to take a look at my loom, which is up in the front. But I love my floor loom, partially because of the kind of release of repetition that the floor loom allows for. So when I get into the rhythm with that, I'm throwing my shuttle back and forth, I'm pushing my pedals to a certain rhythm, and I'm just kind of lost again in the work of weaving. I think handmade work can certainly be beyond the boundaries of stitching and needlework. You might like woodcraft, you might like pottery, you might like painting. Any of those activities that involve the handmade process, there's a built-in meditative part to that, if you find the one that you love the most. The other thing I've learned as I've gotten older and as I've been an educator is that some of us are what we call kinesthetic learners. If you're familiar with learning types, kinesthetic means that we're the type of folks, and I'm very firmly a kinesthetic learner, who listens better, pays more attention, and is more engaged with a verbal or vision process if my hands are engaged. So I was the dean of Lake Sumter State College. I'd go to meetings all over the state, and you could find me sitting and cross-stitching in the midst of 2- and 3-day-long meetings. Everybody around me was generally jealous because I was paying attention to what was going on. I knew what was happening, and at the end of those long, boring meetings, I had accomplished something that they hadn't. So I often suggest to people that if you're frustrated, you want to think a little bit about learning styles. And if you do have that kinesthetic tendency, having something in your hands, probably something repetitious rather than really strongly detailed, is a good idea for you. One joke I heard recently is that cross-stitchers, you can tell somebody's a cross-stitcher, they've been watching the same television program for 20 years, but they don't know what any of the characters look like. We love to watch television, we love to listen, but we're going to be focusing on our work. So I guess my hope for folks is that you'll find a handmade craft that makes you happy, gives you comfort, allows you to find some passion in your creativity. You don't have to worry about whether it's something that somebody else enjoys or even if somebody else wants to see it or not. I think that holds some early crafters back. Ooh, mine is ugly. Mine doesn't look good. Mine's not as good as somebody else's. You certainly can build ability, and you certainly can become better. But if it gives you a certain sense of comfort and strength, then why not? It really does have calming qualities. There are a number of studies that talk about meditative practices and how they lower our blood pressure, how they make us healthier, and I am convinced that this work that I do and that the people I know love has that same effect. The last image I want to place in your head as I kind of finish up talking about this, my youngest son and I took a trip to India just before the pandemic. We got back 3 days before the shutdown, so we were very lucky. But on one of our plane rides from New Delhi to Varanasi, there was a woman on there who was a Buddhist pilgrim. She was not a monk or a nun, she was simply a Buddhist practitioner. But her meditative process as a Buddhist happened to be embroidery. And she sat and watched me for a while on the plane as I was working on what I was doing. And then she pulled out one of the most beautiful pieces of embroidered work with silk that I've ever seen in my life. And the painstaking work that went into it might have boggled some folks' minds, but she understood, and I understood immediately when she told me about it, what a wonderful effect it had had on her. She'd been working on the same piece for over a decade and was not particularly concerned about when or if she ever finished it. It was the process of that led her, and she'd been brought to that by a Buddhist monk who gave her something that would help her in her own meditative practice. So I hope you'll go find something handmade. I hope you'll go find a craft or an activity that gives you the same kind of passion and joy that cross stitch does for me. Thanks. Okay, so what I wanted to show you today is actually an ancient weaving process from Japan called kumihimo. We know that samurai warriors had to know how to do kumihimo because they had to make the cords for their own weapons and their own armor to be sure that it was strong and effective. But I have free kumihimo discs here in the shop, and I've introduced it to a lot of people as a fun, kind of repetitive way to meditate, to calm yourself down, to kind of get into a process. So as you can see, what we did is we took cardboard, we cut it into these 6-sided discs, we put 8 slots around the edge, and we took 7 pieces of yarn, a couple feet long, put 7 into the slots, put a little knot at the bottom, left 1 slot open. So when I'm teaching this with kids, I give them the disc, I say take the open slot, point it towards your belly, count to 3, pull that yarn out, put it into the open slot, turn the disc, point the slot to your belly, count to 3, and just keep going around and around and around. What you're doing, eventually, you're pulling the cord down and you're making these little friendship bracelets using whatever colors you've put into it. I was working with some kids earlier this week and reminding them that they could put beads onto the cord. You can use rawhide, you can use floss, you can use sparkly stuff and make bling bracelets. You can even, after you've made a few of these friendship bracelets, put them into the disc and make a larger cord. A friend of mine who is a bit older was telling me that she got into kumihimo because she and her husband couldn't agree on what to watch for television in the evenings. And so if they're watching something that she doesn't like and her husband insists that's what they're going to be watching for the evening, rather than leaving and going in the other room, she pulls out her kumihimo and works on some cord rather than grind her teeth and wish she were watching something else. This is a nice repetitive process. You can stick one of these in your bag and take it with you. If you Google kumihimo, you'll find that because it's a very popular craft all over the world and originates in Japan, that they make beautiful wooden discs. You can go from 8 slots up to 32 and even 64. You can do kumihimo in a flat format. So there really no end to variations. If you like a little more detail and this is a little bit too simple for you, this is a nice place to start, but there's certainly other places you can go if you want to learn more about kumihimo. So that's my quick tip on a project that anybody can do. It's a great project for kids. It's a great project to help the time pass and feel like you maybe have accomplished something when the time is over. Thanks.